welcome to Dr. Robert Jones, who's with us from Washington today. He is director of the Public Religion Research Institute, which he founded in Washington, which publishes research and public opinion polls on religion, politics, race, about which there was going to be plenty to say. I'm going to ask him a few questions for about 20 minutes and then open the floor to questions from you all. There's a chat box. If you'd like to put questions in there, I can then come to you. I'm hoping somebody from RMC will also alert me to anyone who wants to ask a question, or raise your hand, your blue hand in the chat box, and we'll try and get to you all. Robbie, welcome. You've been working in this whole area of religion, politics and race for a very long time, but you just published a book on white supremacy and its relationship to American Christianity. It's very personal. Your argument is that Christianity has served as a cornerstone for white supremacy in America, and that you, as a white Christian, have been fundamentally shaped by that. And you say, the ways in which white supremacy crept into my worldview, my faith, and even my body are overwhelming. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for having me this morning here. Not morning there, I take it, but appreciate being here at the top of my day anyway. Sure. So I'll tell you just a bit about for context. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, so in the deep South, and I grew up as a Southern Baptist, which is the largest evangelical denomination in the country. It's actually the largest denomination, Protestant denomination of any kind in the country. And my family history goes back very, very far, all in the South. We arrived in Georgia somewhere around 1800. And so I have 6 generations of my family going back to middle Georgia, around Macon, Georgia, on both sides of my family. In fact, I'm the first generation not to live within about a 100-mile radius of Macon, Georgia. And so, this is very deep in my, this kind of connection between Southern culture and evangelical Christianity is very deep in my family's roots. And so what I meant there about how it's shaped is that what I realized is that it wasn't just beliefs, but like so many of my embodied actions that it had kind of shaped. And, everything from, church rituals to the fact that I had a Confederate flag on the front of my truck in high school, because it was the symbol of I went to a public high school that was integrated. And even though it was integrated, it was about half white, half black. That we were the Forest Hill Rebels, like that. So we were we had a Confederate colonel as the mascot of our school. When the football team scored a touchdown, there was a Confederate a cheerleader, a white cheerleader with a Confederate flag running up and down the sideline, celebrating the touchdown. The band played Dixie. I mean, it was very, very steeped there. So, I just realized that it was not just sort of what I believed or what I thought, but actually what I did, that it was so very deep, one could say, like, both in my blood and in my body and in my faith and in my brain.
We talk about white supremacy. You say maybe we should talk about the supremacy of whites as a way of getting away from that image that white supremacy means that you put a white hood on your face and go around lynching people. Can you just say a little bit about how perhaps unhelpful it is to keep that association for people like white Christians like yourself in the States?
Yeah. Well, it's one good thing I would say is that the term white supremacy is actually being used much more in the U.S. just in the last year, and really as a result of the police killing of George Floyd, which was on video that many people saw, and the protests following that. But when I was first beginning to work on the book, it was not a term that was widely used outside of, to talk about violent white supremacists. So the KKK, these kind of white nationalist groups that were committing acts of violence is the only time that term really got used. But I thought that was a real mistake. And so I really wanted to talk about how could we understand this term in a much broader way? And I actually borrow a term from a professor of religion and African American studies at Princeton, Eddie Glaude, who also has a great book out, by the way, called Begin Again, about James Baldwin, that just came out this summer. But he had this, I think, really helpful phrase that's memorable to me. He said, you know, we have to learn to talk about what he calls white supremacy without all the bluster. Right. And so I said, well, what happens if we just try to unpack this a little bit and get away from this term that people, and then I think particularly white people in the US feel fairly defensive about when they hear this term. They're like, oh, no, that's those people doing violent acts. That's not me, has nothing to do with me. But to try to talk about it in a way that we realize, no, it's been sort of part, particularly in what I'm writing about, of the American project from the beginning, and it has absolutely something to do with us. So I just flip the terms around and say, well, instead of talking about white supremacy, what happens if we talk about the supremacy of whites, and we ask, you know, the honest question, well, how have our laws been set up? You know, how have our church teachings been arranged? And when you and have they been about promoting the idea that whites are a superior race, that whites are, you know, to be at the top of the social and political and cultural pyramid, and to be in power, and everyone else is to be under them. And when you ask a question like that, you know, there's just no doubt, there's no way you can really read American history without seeing, yeah, you know, from the beginning of the Republic all the way up through and into the 20th century, this was an explicit agenda, was to kind of have whites, you know, laws, customs, everything that preserve that place of whites at the top of the pyramid.
Just to stay with your personal story a little bit, I mean, you got to be a teenager, early 80s, by which time one might have thought that the gains made in the civil rights movement had sort of leaked into the church somewhat. Just talk to me about how that was not the case in Woodville Heights Baptist Church and many others like it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one of the things I tried to do in this book was to kind of tell my own story and how it reflected, you know, this really marriage and entanglement of white supremacy with Christianity. And, you know, what just a couple of examples. So, you know, in the US, schools were officially desegregated with the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. But I was in elementary school in the 1970s in public schools, and Mississippi managed to drag its feet for more than 20 years. So I remember the first African-American kids showing up at my elementary school. It was really late in the game. And notably when that happened, there was no conversation at all in my church. And I should say, I was that kid. I was at church literally 5 times a week. I was there every time the door was open. You know, so I heard every sermon there was preached. I heard every Sunday school lesson that was taught, and there was just nothing, utter silence about helping us understand what was going on, why all of a sudden were these kids showing up that we didn't know and that didn't live in our neighborhoods. No one helped us understand because the neighborhoods, of course, were segregated. So no one really helped us understand or even have a Christian understanding of what that was. And even the story, I think the most shocking thing is that I was in my 20s, actually. So past my teen years and in seminary, where I was actually went there studying to go into the ministry. And before I ever heard even the origin story of our own denomination. And that is that in 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention was formed when the Northern and Southern Baptists had a rift over whether someone could be a clergy person and enslave other human beings. And the Baptist churches in the North rejected that view and rejected an appointment of someone that the Southern churches had put up for appointment to be a missionary. And the Southern churches said, fine, we think, and actually formed a new denomination explicitly to make, someone who was going to be appointed the minister of the gospel and enslaving other human beings at the same time, that this could actually be perfectly compatible and approved, Christian practice, and that person could be an exemplar for the congregation. And I didn't know that story until I was in my early 20s at seminary, when I finally had a Baptist, professor of history tell me the straight story. So this has all been very submerged, all the way down. And I already gave you the high school example too, right? utterly unreflective. There was no there were very few leverage points to even get enough distance to even see. That's why I call the first chapter in the book "Seeing," because I think that was the most difficult thing. I think is just getting enough distance to even see these things.
I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sort of national church now, in spite of its name. But just briefly, how has it more recently faced up to that path?
Yeah, there have been some efforts. So I should note some of which I think are genuine, some of which I think are more theater. But in 1995, for example, in the 150th anniversary of the founding of the convention, and it did get around to apologizing for its role in upholding and justifying slavery. But this one I think was mostly theater, because even though if you read the statement, it sounds fairly genuine. At the convention, they basically voted to accept this statement of apology, but they orchestrated this little piece of theater where they had an African-American member who was also a Southern Baptist. There are very, very few, but they took one of the few ministers that were African-American, come up on the stage, and within 15 minutes, they had both apologized, and this minister came up and accepted the apology on behalf of all African-Americans in the country. And we went from like an apology to absolution within literally 15 minutes on a stage, at a national convention. And so that I took to be more symbolic than anything. More recently, just too quickly, the Mississippi Baptist Convention, this actually isn't even in the book because it happened after the book, but the Mississippi Baptist Convention, which is the state arm of the national denomination, actually pushed the state legislature and the governor to finally remove the Confederate battle flag from the state of Mississippi's flag. That just happened over the summer. So I think there are some ways in which that I think is that was a kind of costly stand, wasn't necessarily the most popular stand in Mississippi still today. But they're willing to kind of take that move and to say this is the right thing to do. 20 years ago, there was a referendum and there were absolutely no white Christian voices speaking up at all. So it's certainly a sea change from a couple of decades ago.
But your argument in the book is that other churches, mainstream Protestant churches and the Catholic Church, are almost every bit as sort of complicit in what you term the white supremacy of American Christianity as the Southern Baptist Convention is. I mean, some people might be surprised to hear about that, especially in regard to Catholicism.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. I mean, I tell my story, and so my family story is heavily rooted in the evangelical world in the South. But it would maybe be a not so remarkable book if that's really all I was talking about in the book, because that's history that's fairly well known. But I do take some pains to kind of look outside of that world and look at the two other white kind of denominational families in the U.S. are white mainline Protestant churches. That's where sort of the descendants of Anglicanism, the Episcopalian Church sits there, the Methodist Church, Presbyterians, the like. And these churches are really more anchored geographically in the U.S., not in the South, but in the Midwest and the Northeast. So they're outside of that kind of Southern cultural kind of corridor. And also white Catholicism, which is, in the U.S. a more urban faith, less rural, and also more Northeast, more anchored in the Northeast of the U.S. And what I found remarkably there, and I did this kind of looking at both history and public opinion, that there is some differences in degree between these other two factions of white Christianity and white evangelicalism, but it's really more of degree than kind. So just one example, I used, so my day job, we do public opinion research, and I used some recent public opinion surveys to look at the differences across a range of issues. I created what I call a racism index, which is an index of 15 different questions that ask about people's attitudes around systemic racism. So it covers Confederate flags and monuments. It covers economic kind of mobility and limits of economic mobility due to discrimination for African Americans, criminal justice reform, police killings of African Americans in the country, and the like. So it's a very broad index, and it turns out that all those questions actually cohere quite closely together and correlate together. And I combined those into an index of and scored it 1 to 10. And so it may not be so surprising that on that scale, where 10 is holding the most racist attitudes, that white evangelicals score 8 out of 10 on that scale. But when I looked at the other two groups, white mainline Protestants also score 7 out of 10 on that scale, and white Catholics score 7 out of 10 on that scale. So again, some degrees of kind. And then the real thing that I think lets you see the differences. And when I looked at whites who are not Christian, who are not actually unaffiliated with any church or religion, they only score 4 out of 10. And then I did all kinds of modeling and controls to try to figure out whether these things were, what role Christianity independently was taking. And every control I introduced did not dilute this relationship between holding or being having white Christian identity and holding more racist attitudes. So I controlled for party, education, gender, age, region, urban, rural, like all kinds of things to see if those were the kind of alternative explanations. And it turns out that it was actually the Christian identity that was really doing the work on these attitudes.
What about the relationship between, well, people who identify as Christian and sort of people who are very actively religious in terms of church going? Is there any paper that you can put between them?
Yeah, no, that's it's a great question. It's the right question. So I actually looked at this too to see, maybe these are Christians in name only, right? People that just claim to be Christian, but don't really have any connection to church or Christian community, haven't been formed or discipled or shaped by the tradition in any considerable way. It turns out that overall, when I look at white Christians overall, and even checking for those who attend more often than not, there were no differences in these attitudes. So at best, church attendance made no difference in how strongly people held these racist attitudes. And among the group that I grew up in, I can say one extra thing there is that those who attend white evangelical churches, when I asked about that relationship and looked at attendance, it turns out that those who attend more often, among those who attend more often, the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among those who attend more often than less. So in other words, if you're asking about the effect of church attendance on racist attitudes among white evangelicals, attending church more actually makes the problem worse.
And why is that? I mean, is it that there is actually teaching and preaching in these churches and theology in these churches which supports white supremacy, or is it something a bit more subtle?
Well, it's a little both. I think there is kind of overt things that are said. I think there are also, but I think what the bigger thing is that, these churches have inherited, and I think this is the bigger point, that the churches have inherited across the board a theology that was built to be, by design, originally built to be compatible with white supremacy. And it has really not been reformed in any significant way. So even if they're not explicitly preaching sermons that you might have heard, even into the 1960s, that were talking about, the origin story of African Americans being in the story of Cain and Abel, right, where Cain murders his brother Abel, and God, the scripture says that God placed a mark on Cain as punishment, but it doesn't say anything about race. But white theologians and clergy interpreted that to be the origin story of African Americans and other people of color in the world. So it meant that white people could trace their origin story, right, to Adam and Eve and this kind of great story, and people of color trace their origins to a murderer, right? That was the initial progenitor in that telling of the story. So while we're hearing less of that, nonetheless, the rest of the theological, liturgical structures that were fully compatible with that view are still very much with us today, and they very much limit both what white Christians can see and what they're willing to see.
And you also identify some strands of theology and shifts in theology which make it easier for white Christians to evade questions about social justice. Do you want to mention those?
Sure. Martin Luther King Jr., I think, put his finger right on this in Letter from Birmingham Jail, which he wrote from a jail in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And he was writing in that story not to the people doing violent acts and throwing bricks at the civil rights demonstrators or turning the fire hoses on them. He was writing actually to the respectable, what people are seeing as the pillars of the community, the kind of civic and religious leaders. And he was writing with dismay about why they weren't standing up on the side of civil rights. And he asked this question. He said, like, who are these white Christians sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right? And this kind of idea that sitting inside these churches dulled and lulled Christian consciences to sleep, right? That sort of made them feel secure and okay in their religiosity and in their Christianity, while ignoring the storm outside, just outside the windows. That was certainly my experience growing up, right? And there was absolutely no. Again, I'm in Mississippi in the 1970s and the 1980s. There's all kinds of civil rights actions going on, and all kinds of still resistance to desegregation going on. There's not one syllable uttered inside the walls of my church about any of that growing up. And theologically, just I'll point to one thing here, that it has come down to, I think, the way that white evangelicals in particular, but this is actually diffused much more through American culture into the white mainline and white Catholic churches in the U.S. This idea of having a individual personal relationship with Jesus, right? That very individualistic way of thinking about religion, so that the beginning and the end of proper religion is just this interior individual relationship with Jesus, has a way of kind of putting blinders on to systemic or structural things outside. So one can feel quite confident in a kind of pietistic, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but a kind of interior, emotive, affective piety that sits quite comfortably with injustice everywhere, all around us. And I think that limiting way of thinking about salvation as this very personal and hyper individualistic thing has been part of the formula of how white Christians have really kept themselves from feeling responsible.
And I'll mention one other one that you talk about, which is the shift from a sort of premillennial theology to post-millennial. So the idea that rather than build the kingdom of heaven on earth and achieve some sort of end that way, we just let the world go completely to hell in a handcart, and then Jesus will come all the quicker. So we won't bother with fighting all sorts of forms of injustice and so on. And that was another thing that you spoke about there. I wonder whether we could now just bring in a question or two, and then perhaps we'll go on to look specifically about what the ramifications of all this are for the election. But Helen Painter's got a question. If somebody could unmute her. Helen's the director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence in Bristol. Helen says, what hope is there of meaningfully impacting grassroots Christians in the USA through theological education? She suggests that the theological education of evangelical pastors is pretty siloed, which means that that there could be some positive approaches going on here in sort of ways of interpreting the Bible. Sorry, Helen, if I've not got that as well as I might.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think it has been one of the great failures of theological education and really clergy leadership in white churches in the U.S. that many clergy have not taken this up. And it's been I think in the U.S. perhaps some of this is about the way that churches are structured here, that congregations can just vote their clergy out, right, if they take a stand that's a little too distant from where the congregation is. And I'll give you an example. Just even today, I was scheduled to do or was invited to do a talk like this in some churches in the western part of North Carolina. It's a very rural area near the Appalachian Mountains, and it was canceled, right? And why was it canceled? Because the clergy person who was sponsoring it was getting major complaints about this being something they didn't want to take up, and was feeling pressure that if he put this on, it might actually put his position at risk. And so it got canceled. So we're still having that today. One other quick comment on that is there was a book out, I think in the sort of late 70s, maybe early 80s, called The Gathering Storm in the Churches, that was writing, and the argument of that book was that there was going to be this great rift in American congregations because there were these liberal theological schools putting out people with critical approaches to the Bible and ways of kind of understanding the Bible, and that they were going to land in these congregations that weren't ready for that, and that the congregations and the clergy were going to be at odds. And what ended up happening was that the clergy just accommodated themselves. Really, that storm never happened because the clergy, for the most part, just accommodated themselves to the congregation. So I think in the U.S. case, and particularly in the mainline denominations, it has been less that they didn't get those tools, and more that when they got in the parishes and congregations, they didn't quite put them to use.
Can I bring in Usama Hassan? He mentions in the chat that as well as the Cain and Abel reference, there was the curse of Ham, of course. But Usama, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Fascinating. So apart from the Cain and Abel reference, there's also the curse of Ham, of course. I've just posted a link to that in the chat. But I had another question, which I think relates to Bruce's question in the chat, where he asks about correlation with the German church of the 1930s. My related question was also the Dutch churches in South Africa. Have you looked into that? It's always struck me that the whole apartheid system was, supported by white Dutch churches. So have you looked into those correlation between the US, Germany in the 30s, and South Africa, the apartheid in South Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those. So I don't write about this in the book, but I think that these correlations are quite right. And in fact, I wrote a piece after the book came out, really tying some of these connections, because one of the things I did is a quick personal anecdote. I did not share the manuscript with my parents or my family until I was done. And I just was a little worried about the reaction, and I didn't want to kind of flinch. And so I want to make sure the manuscript was wrapped. So I sent it to them, but I sent it to them with the cover letter. And one of the things that I reflected on in the cover letter was that was this connection. And I remember the first time I went to sort of into the concentration camps in Germany was in college. So I was in my 20s, not long after I'd just gotten this revelation about the origin story of our own denomination. And that connection was so clear to me that the ways in which churches have been complicit in not only not standing up to these things, but complicit in building the conditions, all right, for the rise of Hitler, for the apartheid movement in South Africa. They weren't just passive standers-by, but they were part of the kind of structure that legitimized the conditions on the ground, for this from the beginning. And so I think that this is one of the parts of truth telling I'm really wanting to do in the U.S., because until you really face this history, there's not really a possibility of reform, right? You won't even see the need for reform. But to say to the Dutch churches, oh yeah, there's no need for reform. This whole apartheid thing was just a kind of slight detour, or to say to the Lutheran churches in Germany, yeah, no need to really do much soul searching over your role in the rise of the Nazi party in Germany. Just a little side detour, would be absurd and ludicrous. And yet, I think in the U.S. context, we have not nearly begun to face the real need for deep soul searching about our role over nearly all of American history in supporting white supremacy.
And just to say thank you, Robert, I actually think it's a good thing that congregations can vote out their clergy. And I speak as an imam who was actually voted out by my own congregation for becoming too liberal. And I accepted that, fair enough. If you lose your congregation, you actually can't do your job properly anyway. So I just thought I'd share that with you. There's a teaching of the Prophet in the Hadith tradition, which says an imam whose congregation is unhappy with him or her, I suppose, their prayer is not accepted. The imam's prayer is not accepted. So it's kind of regarded as very dangerous to lead people where they don't accept you as the leader. So I just thought I'd throw that in. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll bring in a question now from Sociology Warwick, which I think is Alex Smith from Warwick University. Alex, are you there?
Hi, yeah. Thanks a lot, Robert, for joining us today. I mean, I think I'm very sympathetic to the arguments of the book, actually. And what I particularly like is the way that you've brought in mainline religions in the US, because the Southern Baptist Church is kind of, a bit of an easy target in a sense with a lot of these issues. But taking seriously Eddie Glaude's argument that we need to talk about white supremacy without all the bluster. I mean, I've been engaged in long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Northeast Kansas, and I've been interested in progressive and progressive politics and politics of moderation across state politics. And what I discovered embarking on what I thought would be a political study is that this is also a study of theology and religion, because most of the political actors in Kansas do have some kind of ground in a theological tradition. And a lot of the progressives do as well. And if we were to take, so my question is, if we were to take seriously, and maybe you've done a little bit of thinking about this, maybe you've got a future book planned about this, I'd be very interested actually. But if we take seriously white supremacy without all the bluster, I think we need to take seriously the challenge of thinking about structural racism in the United States and in countries like the UK and elsewhere, to which, part of the argument is that white supremacy, when white people get defensive, is all about the blind spots that white society has in terms, the structural legacies are legacies that a lot of white people get defensive because they don't see them themselves. And this is the idea of white privilege, right? And the thing that occurred to me many times when I was working in Kansas, going to the Plymouth Congregational Church, famously the first church in Kansas Territory and the like, people working in the Congregationalist tradition, the Methodist tradition, and on abolitionism and all sorts of social reform issues, they all lined up on the right side, right? But they still had quite a few blind spots, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how you would extend this argument into the world of progressive religious theology and progressive traditions in Christianity in the US, where I do think there's lots of blind spots, but eventually they'll have to be taken seriously too, if we are to take the issue of dismantling white supremacy absolutely seriously. And I think you can sort of get there by going through the mainline church stuff that you've really, very it's a very good move to bring them into the conversation. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks. That's super interesting. Kansas is a really interesting place. I mean, as you noted, so in Kansas, about a quarter of the population is white evangelical, but nearly as many are white mainline Protestant in Kansas, right? Okay. So you kind of have this parity in Kansas that's interesting as it kind of moves a little bit out of the deep South and more in the middle of the country. So you have both of these traditions kind of at almost equally in the state. One of the things I was so struck by is, if you look at the mainline, more progressive, which is the more progressive end of white Protestantism in the country, and you were just doing an intellectual history of the National Council of Churches, or even the main denominational bodies of the United Church of Christ or the United Methodists, the Episcopalians, and you look at the statements that they put out around civil rights, around structural racism, criminal justice reform, they're kind of on the right side of that issue almost every single time. I mean, they're maybe a little late to the game in some cases, but it's there, right? There's a very steady history you could do from the 70s for sure on up, even the 60s on up. But there was such a great distance between those statements and the congregations on the ground. I think that was the biggest gap that happened, is that those things didn't get carried down really into the congregational level. And there's a couple of examples. At the same time that so the Christian, I mentioned Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. That was actually first published in the Christian Century, which is a mainline Protestant magazine, right, connected with the National Council of Churches. So it was, and they had Martin Luther King Jr. on the editorial board of the magazine. So I mean, they were very much all in. Those went to mostly white mainline Protestant churches. In the same year that he wrote that, and they were doing that, an Episcopalian school, an Episcopalian private school in Atlanta denied Martin Luther King III, his son, admission on the basis of race. right? So at the same time, you got the Episcopal dominational body kind of putting out all these progressive statements. You've still got these other things not happening. But I think the biggest thing is that down at the congregational level, those statements didn't really get down and have the kind of teeth that they did. And I think that mix of I do think there was this kind of diffusing of a kind of evangelical way of thinking about things, like that personal relationship with Jesus kicks in Methodist churches in Kansas. And even though it's really more at home in the evangelical world, it kind of has diffused through that wall, I think, into a way of thinking that has really, again, I think, isolated and insulated is the word I'm looking for, those white Christian consciences in really similar ways. The one thing I would say, though, is that the mainline churches do have a history that they could mine in a different way than the evangelical churches, a theological history they could mine in a different way that does give them tools to get a handle on structural injustice. There are theological traditions there, Walter Rauschenbusch and others that they could tap that really aren't there in the evangelical world. So I'd say that's one leverage point that I think is different there.
Can I bring in Ben Rich now? Ben's got a question about evangelical churches.
So this comes from a very lay point of view, but one of the things that I've just never understood is the sort of strong continuation of the separate black and white evangelical churches. And whilst, I understand socially from the bottom up that might drive that, what efforts are there from the top down to combine churches, to bring at least church congregations to meet together? And isn't that part of the solution? And is it part of anything that's happening?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the, if you were to kind of do the kind of, famous intellectual experiment, intellectual kind of exercise of saying, what would you see and the way that that churches behave in the U.S. if you were kind of an anthropologist from Mars and suddenly dropped down onto the U.S. landscape to kind of observe for a year? And I don't know, Professor Warwick, you may have felt like that when you dropped down in the middle of Kansas a bit, trying to observe things. But what's remarkable in the U.S. is that even in political science, the way that religion is studied, we typically, in sociology and political science, when we're doing quantitative studies, we always break out Christians by race and ethnicity in terms of studying them and categorizing them into boxes. So we separate African American Protestants from white evangelical Protestants and white mainline Protestants. And the reason for that is because their histories are so different. The denominational structures are still largely segregated. Martin Luther King's quip that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning in the U.S. is the most segregated hour in the country is still largely true. Only about 15% of U.S. churches are integrated in a way that we would not call them monoracial. So that is, if we set the bar at even only having 20% of the non-dominant racial group in the church, only 15% of churches meet that bar. So they're still very largely, segregated. Denominations are still largely segregated. And also, I think one of the biggest challenges for bridging these divides that has made black-white conversations harder than it has ever been is the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and the partisanship that went along with the partisan polarization that went along with that election. So, for example, we just put out at PRI our big pre-election survey earlier this week, and we found that 8 in 10 white evangelical Protestants are still planning on voting for President Trump. That number among African American Protestants is 5. Right. So there's literally a 75-point political difference between white evangelicals and African American Protestants, who also, by the way, overwhelmingly identify as evangelical. So this political rift, I think, has been one of the biggest challenges there was actually some headway being made prior to 2016 that I think has almost completely stalled out. Because of the political polarization in the country, and in particular around the president's handling of the protests for racial justice this year following the death of George Floyd. I mean, that has really poured, and the president, in my opinion, has poured gasoline on those fires in a way There's been a lot of African Americans that have publicly written, for example, that they were part of these reconciliation efforts between Black and white churches, that have written that they've just bailed out, that they don't even think it's worth trying anymore. So I think there's a fair amount of despair on there. Despite all that, there are a few churches, and I think where this is going to happen is at the local level. I don't think there's going to be much merging. I think, for one thing, African American churches don't want to merge with white churches. They kind of want their own space in many ways. There's a long cultural and political history there that is for why they've been organizing hubs for the Black community in many cities. And so I think that space is important. But partnerships between Black and white churches, I think that's the future and where this is really going to happen. I write in the book, at the end of the book, about two churches in Macon. I won't go into too much detail here, but just to flag it, but two Baptist churches in Macon that have gone on this 7-year journey of trying to build community between the two churches in ways that I think have been really quite beautiful and powerful. But it's taken, a 7-year, very deliberate and committed attempt by the two clergy people and the boards of deacons in both churches to really make that happen.
Okay, I'm going to go to Nathan now from Theos Think Tank. I think you wanted to dig a bit deeper into the questions over the election. Nathan.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, Robert, I was going to ask about any significant shifts in voting intention among white evangelicals for the presidential election. And I'm conscious you've already given us the stat 8 out of 10 is quite sobering. Yep. And it fits with the previous numbers. But I wanted to ask if you could go a little bit deeper in and give us some insight and some comment on how you see these numbers kind of holding in relation to kind of the flaring up of the race question post the killing of George Floyd, and in light of the history which you've kind of been helpfully bringing out through your larger work. Thanks.
Yeah. Can I share my screen real quickly? We didn't really talk about this ahead of time. Do I have the power to do that? I think somebody has to give me permission. If not, I can talk it through, but if I could throw up a slide real quick if we can do that.
Is that all right, Ollie? Don't know if Ollie can hear us. Just give it a try. And
okay.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay, Rosie.
Share is now allowed. All good. I've just activated it for you.
Let's see. It looks like it's still disabled, but I'll talk it through. So, we see the two numbers that I gave are actually the ones that haven't moved, right? So white evangelicals, African-American Protestants, they have always staked out the kind of two far ends of the religious landscape in terms of voting patterns. One of the really interesting things that we're seeing, though, is that white Catholics are actually shifting in this race. They're really important because in those key, in our electoral college battle, and in the upper Midwest states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, these are really important. And they're white mainline Protestants and white Catholics are actually as big or bigger a part of Trump's base than evangelicals are in those upper Midwest states, right? Because evangelicals are more populous in the South. So the path through really has to be he has to pick up white Catholic and white mainline voters. And in both cases, Biden's support at this stage in the game is 10 points higher than Hillary Clinton's support was at this stage in the game among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. So that spells trouble, I think. It's also worth noting and remembering that Joe Biden himself is a white Catholic, right? So I think there's some appeal there. And if it's not appeal, it's at least a resistance to demonizing him. And I think that kind of gives some more resilience in those numbers. So I think when we held up kind of what was important, that was the kind of one of the most important things that we held up. Oh, it looks like I've got it here. Let me just share this real quick. Just see it here. Just so you can get a good look at it. So this is the landscape. There's evangelicals. These are all the groups that are voting really heavily for Joe Biden. So Latino Catholics, non-Christian religious groups, that's Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, etc. The religiously unaffiliated, lopsided there. And then there's the two groups. You see that he's running head to head with white mainline Protestants. He's running, and Biden's up by 51-41, up 13 points among white Catholics today. But both of those numbers among white mainline, white Catholic, Trump won both of those groups by 6 and 10 or more in 2016. So that's a real sea change, and that's the group. that's there. And I'm going to just show you one thing on this because it's related to where, going to click through this one of this quick slide of where they are on this this issue is it's not this favorability, it's on the racial justice question. There it is. So on this question of police killing of African-American men by police, which I think has shifted the debate a bit in the US, white evangelicals have not moved at all. So we had a question we asked in 2015 versus today, percent who say the killing of African-Americans by police are isolated incidents, that is who don't connect the dots as part of a pattern of how African-Americans are treated. So white evangelicals, 7 in 10 see them as isolated incidents. And in 2015, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics actually agreed with them. But over time, those views have shifted among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. Now, there's still a majority of them thinking that, but it's double digits fewer than there were in 2015. So you can see these debates over racial justice have actually impacted the views of white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, and it's created some daylight between those groups in a way that wasn't there, 5 years ago.
Richard Green, I think you're from CNN, is that right, Richard?
Yes, I am, that's right. Hi. Robbie, I haven't read White Too Long yet, but I did read your previous book, The End of White Christian America, ? I think it ended. How do these two books interact, if at all? Is there a continuum between these two books? Are you building a case between the two of them?
Thanks, I appreciate that, and thanks for reading the previous book. I think so. I do see this one as an extension of the previous book. For those who didn't read it, the previous book was really looking at demographic changes in the U.S. as an explanation for, I think, why I think our politics, in many ways, I think it explains how the stage was set for Donald Trump to kind of capture white evangelical support. But it really is about, I think, the fact that we are at this hinge moment in the US in terms of demographic change. So just real quickly, we have gone really from being, just in the last 10 years, from being a majority white Christian country to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. And the end of white Christian America, I was tracing that drop from 2008 to 2014, and it went 54% to 47%. That we had dropped. So we crossed this threshold just between 2008 and 2014. The numbers dropped 3 more percentage points today. It's 44 today. So, we've basically dropped 10 percentage points in a little more than a decade. And we've crossed this threshold. I think the crossing of the threshold is really the important piece here. Because I think that one of the big things we're fighting over is not policy in the country, but it is really over who is America, and that word America, it has a kind of cultural resonance to it, right? Not who is the United States, but who is America, who gets to claim to be an American, who is properly an American. I mean, these are the questions that are really dividing the two political parties these days. It's why things like immigration and we've seen a lot of anti-Black rhetoric is at the forefront of everything instead of healthcare. That's really kind of what the visceral fights are really over these days. And I think it's because we are shifting. We've always, I think, as a country, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have always seen themselves as America, right? We are America. And I think the fact that now, that group is much less, in the cultural majority. We also, for example, among conservative white Christians, things like abortion, same-sex marriage, opposition has also been very strong. Our last poll had 70% support for same-sex marriage in the US today, 70. Majorities of seniors support that in the US today, right? So white evangelicals are the only group, they're like out on an island now. They're the only religious group opposing same-sex marriage. And that wasn't true 10 years ago. I mean, they could say that most of the country was with us on that issue 10 years ago. So I think culturally speaking, demographically speaking, that shift is kind of why we're there. And I guess if I'm thinking about the new book, part of the way that we get through this and we get to a healthier place, I think we have to we are at a moment of reckoning. It requires some truth telling. And I'm hoping that this new book is kind of putting out there, a push to tell the truth in a way that's kind of medicinal, that really does get us to a greater place of health at the end of the day, even if the medicine itself is kind of bitter.
But part of that medicine, in a way, as far as white evangelicals, would be, I suppose, reassuring them in some way, wouldn't it? Because it's clearly they're looking at the end of their supremacy, of their ability to call the shots in elections, and therefore it's fear that's motivating them, isn't it? It's sort of like, let's go back to the old days. Let's not just make America great again. Let's take America back to where it was when we, were supreme in the court, as it were.
Well, it's really tricky. I mean, because there is a kind of grief and loss, right, of this place of power. I think the way we do it is, at the end of the book, I make the argument that, white Christians should take up this difficult work of truth telling, not as some self-flagellating, kind of punishment, but really as a way to restore, kind of stay with this health metaphor, to restore our own health. I mean, James Baldwin talked about white supremacy as a kind of madness that whites had inflicted upon themselves. And when you think about the kind of mental and spiritual contortions that one has to do to make, a religion and to make Christianity and the gospel compatible with white supremacy, it's quite damaging, right? And it's not just damaging to others who we mistreat, but it's damaging to our own psyches. That's something that Douglas, King, all saw, right? The damage that whites were doing, we were doing to ourselves by trying to uphold this unjust status quo, is something that's been lost on whites. So I think there's actually a quite positive motivation here. If we think about, I think often the loss is only when we look back. So we're losing our heritage. You'll hear that language a lot. We're kind of turning our backs on our ancestors. But I do think it's true on this particular case that, we white Christians, and we've got a choice here to make. I mean, we can either defend, our grandparents and our progenitors, or we can hand down a healthier faith to our kids, but we can't do both. And I think we've got a real decision to make. But I think that there is some pride to be taken in being the generation, right, that finally weeds out and uproots white supremacy from our faith and hands something healthier down to our kids so they don't have to deal with it, because it's not going away. We've kicked this can down the road for 150 years after the abolition of slavery. And, it's going to stay with us. I know we're close to time, but this one quick quote from Baldwin, he mentioned that if we can find the courage, he talked about the courage and love to tell the truth. And these are his words: we can end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world. He wrote that 50 years ago in The Fire Next Time, but it could have been written this morning.
Well, there's just time for you to give us, if you will, dare, your prediction for what's going to happen on November the 3rd or thereafter.
Yeah, well, we've all learned our lessons on that. I think all of us in the kind of polling world. I do think it's worth saying that, like, whatever we've got right now, they are snapshots of where the country is on this day, that are in the field period that the polls were measuring. And just a quick reminder, polls were not meant to be, these sort of things we consult to tell the future, but they are snapshots in time of kind of where we are today. So what I can say today, is that it certainly looks, both at the state level and at the national level, that Biden has a clear advantage. And I think the real shifts are to watch, where white college educated women, Catholics, white Catholics, and seniors. I think those are the three groups to really watch. And among all those groups, between the coronavirus and the handling of the protests over racial justice, they give him fairly low marks on those things, which are the things roiling the country right now. So, I would say outlook is good for Biden, but man, there's no good prediction with all the uncertainties we've got going with mail-in voting and in-person voting and all of that. So I think we're all going to just stay buckled up until the election.
I overlooked a question. I do apologize. Tim Hutchings has just got a quick question to throw in at this moment. Tim.
Thanks very much. We have had a lot of news this week from the UK government stating via the Junior Equalities Minister that the teaching of white privilege or critical race theory in schools will be illegal, to teach those things as uncontested fact. So my fellow teachers and I have been having some difficult conversations about how on earth we can teach something like white privilege as anything other than an uncontested fact. So I wanted to ask Dr. Jones if he had any recommendations for how we can use his book in the classroom in the current situation.
Yeah, good Lord. So here's what I would say is that you know, we're seeing this in the U.S., of course, too, and I think universities are having to figure this out. I mean, I know there's at least one, I think it was University of Iowa, double check me there, I've got that right, but it was a big state university in the Midwest that put a halt on all their diversity training because their lawyers were unclear whether it ran afoul of the Trump administration's mandate on any federally funded activities not teaching critical race theory. I think the bigger question to ask is, why is that seen to be a threat, right? And why at this moment is that seen to be a threat? And I think it is precisely because we are at this moment of reckoning where it's going to matter, right? And where we're at this tipping point, and you know, I think there is real possibility that we're going to really face this. And there's of course resistance to that, and people are leaning in to kind of bringing the gears of government to bear on that. And so I think it's a real challenge because it is the question of our day, I think. I mean, I firmly believe 20 years from now, historians will be writing about 2020 and the year of racial reckoning in 2020. And you know, it's a real struggle, but I think a lot of us like to think, you know, and I'm trying to kind of hold my own feet to the fire here too, that we like to think that we would have been on the right side of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, often not realizing what kind of costs there were for the people who were on the right side of those battles in the 1960s, and to say to myself, look, whatever I'm doing now is exactly what I would have been doing had I been an adult and alive in the 1960s. So, you know, trying to just hold my own feet to the fire and try to do the right thing and try to find ways to resist, you know, when we feel like there really are powers that are being brought to bear to uphold the final tottering structure of white supremacy.
Well, we must leave it there. There was a glimmer of hope there in that final answer there, Robert. Thank you so much for being with us. It's been really great. I'm sure everybody wants to join me in thanking you. And I know we're going to want you back. Whether you have time is another matter, but I know we're going to want you back to reflect on what happens in November. But
I'd be happy to do that, yeah.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll be back next week for another Conversation Zoom. Bye-bye.